Okay, and so welcome to the college lecture series. This is the third college lecture series of the fall semester to 2020. And the presentation today is, of course, by Rob Faivre, What are Concepts for, the title of the presentation. Dr. Faivre is professor of English at SUNY Adirondack, where he has taught since 1993. He has studied at University of Vermont, Syracuse University, University of Minnesota, and more recently, University at Albany, where he received his doctorate degree. His scholarly writings have been published in Class in Education, the Minnesota Review, 19th Century Prose, Nature and Society and Thought. And he is also co-editor of Human All Too Post-Human, The Humanities After Humanism. He is also currently writing a book on critical pedagogy and transdisciplinary writing studies. It's such a pleasure to have Dr. Rob Faivre presenting for us. Once again, on behalf of the Professional Development Committee, I would like to welcome you all. Rob, you're on.
Thank you. So I want to share my screen today. Will I have the right to do that, Jivan?
I think so, yeah.
You think so?
Yeah, I made you a co-host, so I don't know. I can't
good.
See your screen.
All right. So I'll share my screen and open the PowerPoint.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, I'm not just going to read what's on the screen, because that is what my brother calls death by PowerPoint. He was subjected to it every week in his work in hospitals. So I'm not doing that. We get that enough in meetings, but I do have on this, what I will have on the screen are some visuals that will relate to what I'm talking about. There's not pictures, there's not moving parts. It's going to be, you know, just text, but I'll speak from a read most of what appears there. And I'm not speaking from a script. If I was at a conference, I don't speak off the cuff, but in the classroom, I don't really speak from a script either. You know, I have text that I'm working from, but it's more in the give and take between people, which all of you know is very hard in this era of the pandemic, where we're teaching online and we don't always have that face-to-face contact with people that I have sort of with a lot of you right now. So I know when I go to the PowerPoint, it's going to be the PowerPoint and maybe my little talking head in the corner. So I'm planning to talk for 30 to 40 minutes, but I can come up for air anytime. So if you have a question, pop up a hand. You know, this is not a train that has to reach a destination. In fact, this is the first of two presentations. In today's presentation, I want to introduce you to a project that I'm working on with students in second semester writing courses as part of a sabbatical. A year from now, I'd like to do a kind of capstone or bookend presentation to this that talks about how did it go, where did it go, what did we find out, what did we learn, where is this going? Right, so this is really part of a kind of experiment. In fact, that's how I'm framing it with students. We're calling the writing classes writing labs, which makes sense in the science writing class and to a certain extent in the social science writing class. But I also have just a 102 academic writing where students are working on this as well. And the lab format is working pretty well for me to propose something to work on with students, and then to use their essays and their kind of reflections on what did we learn, what did we get, now what do we move into? Okay, so I'm gonna start the PowerPoint. First, I'll share the screen. So it says that the host has disabled participant screen sharing. So can you grant me, Jivan, can you grant me screen sharing rights?
Sure. This is strange. Okay. You are the host now.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm screen sharing. Well, that's not what I want you to see. I want you to see this. So what are concepts for is the question. Another question that I have is what do concepts do? especially with that example of so-called divisive concepts. If concepts can be divisive, then we're granting a kind of agency to concepts. We're saying concepts do something. And so that to me is kind of interesting. What does it mean that concepts aren't just tools that we use, but they have a kind of agency, that they have an ability to act on the world, or at least on our minds, and therefore our practices in the world. So this question, what are concepts for, could also be seen as, what do concepts do? Notice that's different than what are concepts, which the two philosophers I'm going to engage will be asking us to think about. So as I said, this is part one. So I've made a proposition that I have to say I wrote rather hastily when Jivan invited me to present. And I said, well, what's a bumper sticker that I could put on this that would irritate people? Because I find that that's one thing that writing can do, is writing can irritate people, right? Writing can be a dialogue, writing can be a quarrel, right? It can get under our skin. So the proposition I put forward here is that conception exceeds perception, right? So clearly that has to be unpacked. So one of the questions we could ask is, well, what is conception? And my other proposition here would be that concepts enable explanation. Concepts help us to explain things. Concepts make it possible for us to explain things. So if we think explanation is important, we need concepts. That's a proposition. I put it out there, and that's one of the things I'm exploring with students. Secondly, what is perception? Because if conception, I'm saying, exceeds perception, well, what is that? Perception, I would say, is that which requires an explanation, right? If we perceive something, it needs to be explained, right? If we want to know what's going on there. I suppose we could just have our perceptions, but, you know, if I see Sasquatch crossing the street, I would like to explain, what's that? What's going on? And so another way to state conception exceeds perception is that explanation exceeds experience. Now I realize that I haven't explained the verb, the active verb in the sentence here. What does it mean to exceed, right? Goes beyond or contains, right? So I wanted to engage that by engaging the usual objection to that question. How do I make myself go away here? I'll put it over here. So the usual objection to this idea that we can explain things is that no, everybody knows that perception exceeds conception. And the reasons for this is that, you know, what we perceive is just a limited part of what is, right? I see colors, it's just Roy G. Biv. I see colors, and I can't see all the colors that exist, all the shades of light. I just perceive a limited part of what actually exists. And that conception, or having concepts, is an attempt to define what is. And when you define something, you put limits on it, right? When you define, you say, this is that, this is not that, right? So, but everyone knows that we perceive far more than we can or do conceive. This is a common idea that I hear expressed in the classroom, I hear expressed in the media, I hear expressed in meetings. You know, we can't understand all the issues, so let's start with the low-hanging fruit. That is the only time I'm going to use that phrase in this whole presentation. Usually that phrase goes along with these here. So one of the problems we have to face is the problem of limits, right? Our sensory perception, our eyes, our ears, all of our senses have limits. They might be biological limits, they might be anatomical limits, they might be limits that came at some other point in our life. But also our cognition, our whole conceptual apparatus has limits too. And I don't know that either of those statements are controversial. They would be interesting to talk about with a psychologist, with an anthropologist, with a zoologist, for example. And so one of the questions that we have in the class is, you know, are the things that limit perception the same as what limit conception, or are they different? Are the things that enable our perception the same as what might enable our conception, our ability to explain, right? So is that which defines our experience the same as or different that which defines our ability to explain our experience? So I put this question out there for students and I say, look, you're taking psychology, You're taking anthropology, you're taking mathematics and statistics and economics. You know, how are these questions dealt with in these different fields? I'm just a writing teacher. I don't know anything. I'm just going to help you how to read and write, right? I don't have a subject, right? But actually, I think we do, as I'll explain in a moment. So what I'm trying to do in these writing classes is to engage these kinds of questions, but obviously to ground them in something, to ground them in the work that students are doing in other classes. So this year, as part of my, you know, I'm in my 28th year, I think, here of teaching writing at Adirondack. I have the sabbatical project to address these kinds of questions through research, I'm interviewing some professors, I'm doing a lot of reading, some scholarship, working on an essay, trying to get into conferences, and also experiments with students. And that's what's taking up, you know, most of my time is engaging with students in how do we experiment to see what are the concepts you know you're working with? What are the secret or hidden or quiet concepts? What are the things we need to conceptualize? Is there anything that's not a concept that you don't know how to explain, you don't know how to put together? And this is in, as I said before, 3 different classes this term: a social science writing course, a science writing course, and an academic writing course. In the spring, I'll be working just with the science writers and the social science writers. And these tend to be nurses, engineers, but also liberal arts and humanities folks too, and people who just picked the class because of the time that it landed on. So the point of these experiments is to conceptualize concepts, right? To think, what does it mean to think about thinking, or to kind of unpack our concepts, and to address not only the conventions, like what are the concepts that we encounter in the different academic disciplines in our courses, including English course, including writing class, what are the concepts that we would use in a writing class, but also in our daily life, and the thinking, the writing, the reading, the consumption of media, the production of media that we do in daily life. What concepts are operating in there? How conscious are we of those concepts? So the whole point to me of teaching and learning is to get past what we think we already know, to get past what we could call common sense notions. You know, I was often told as a teenager, especially, that I had no common sense. And then I learned in college that the whole point of education was to no longer accept common sense. So there's this interesting tension between these two things, right? So one of the questions that I put to students is, you know, what are the concepts that we can bring into a writing class from other classes? So what are you learning in anthropology? What are you learning in math? What are you learning in psychology, et cetera? What are concepts that seem important in those classes that you're being asked to use to think in those classes? And can they be actively transferred into a writing class? Now, what kind of set me up for this is that clearly a social science writing class has to engage the concepts of social science. I'm not a sociologist, right? But I do need to be able to help students to recognize when is there a term that's special to a field, and when is there a term that's available for everyday use. And one of the concepts we use to define between these is the concept of threshold concepts. And there's a lot of literature on threshold concepts and transfer of knowledge. And threshold concepts are the key terms of a field, right? So if you asked Val, you know, what are the key terms of anthropology, and you asked Amy, what are the key terms in mathematics, they're going to tell you a whole different set of terms. To me, it'd be interesting to see what happens if they overlap. You know, if you ask John in art, what is the line? And then you go to somebody who teaches geometry or cartography, right? Then how is the line in art like or not like the line in geometry or cartography or engineering or any other space that has a concept of line? Is it the same concept? Is it a convention that crosses the disciplines? Or are there distinct concepts, right? Such as, you know, Terry mentioned the concept of caste, C-A-S-T-E. If you look at caste in anthropology, in economics, in sociology, how might that be like or unlike the way in which it's used in a popular book that's put out there not for anybody in a particular field? And I'm not even sure if that author is a social scientist or, you know, if they're a journalist who kind of took up this idea. How does caste differ from class, differ from, any other group, for example? So one of the things I wanted to tell you a little bit about was, the concepts that I'm trying to bring into the course and asking the students to bring into the course so they can write about them, we can examine them, and we can think about what do these concepts do? If you have a concept of caste, what does that do? If you have a concept of deep time from geology, what does that do for you, right? How do you approach a question like, arguing about global warming with your uncle differently than if you didn't have a concept of deep time? Another thing is, and this is my second point here, what are the sources that I as a professor can provide to kind of use dialogue as a wedge? And that's going to make up a big chunk of what I'm about to talk about with you. Because there's a couple of texts I've been using for many years in writing classes by two philosophers that theorize the concept very differently in a way that underrates a lot of our talk about concepts today, including the common sense and the anti-common sense. Maybe that's a new concept, anti-common sense. I'm going to write it down. All right, so one of the questions that we have is, why might we want to accept the common sense or the conventional ways of thinking? And when might we want to question the common sense? Or are there times where the conventional ways of thinking break and give over to other ideas? And what decides this? And do concepts have any role in that? So one of the ways we started the class is from students. Every week, since we went online, I just ask every week on Monday, Sunday night or Monday, contribute a concept to the class. They need to name and define the concept, right? They need to discuss the significance or the value of that concept. What's its use in the original context where you found it, and perhaps beyond. And maybe they've been primed to think about, oh, maybe I want to bring in a concept that's a threshold concept in literary studies, or maybe I want to bring in a concept that I heard in two different classes. For example, I had a student who was taking an economics course, and he encountered a concept from his electrical engineering courses, the concept of a circuit. And he's trying to decide, is this truly the same concept in these different fields, an electrical circuit and a circuit of the production and sale of goods? Or is it more of a metaphorical or analogy relationship? And he's really struggling through that question, and it's kind of interesting to watch him do that, right? Other students are bringing in concepts that didn't come from their other classes. What is love? Or what is power? And like, they're these huge abstractions. I'm like, no. Go to your class. Don't just pull it out of the ether, right? Don't just read off a bumper sticker. Where did you get it? What are its roots? How is it being used? Because if you're going to try to write an essay about what is love, you got to root it in something, or you're just going to hate love. So one of the questions the students have and I have is, where does this lead? In the class, it leads to discussion. I try to have them discuss it online. We try to discuss it in the synchronous sessions when we meet. I ask them to write an essay where they conceptualize that concept from another class. In some cases, we might be making presentations, and I'm still figuring out, but at the very least, discussion and writing, and that so far has been pretty interesting. And it's led to some essays that students are engaged in because they're engaging in their other subjects, and they say, oh, if I take the opportunity to try to write about it over here in writing class, that might help me back in that, take that anthropology test or that, geology test or whatever. But they also find that, look, I'm not an expert in those fields. So they have a kind of, if not expertise, they have a claim to at least equal authority to me over that subject that maybe I've never even taken a class in. So one of the things we do is we need to read, right? This was a subject of my dissertation, actually, how reading is a social act that changes us. And so I provide readings for students. And, a lot of people talk about how, well, students don't read anymore, right? I mean, people have been saying that since the invention of reading, and then the invention of television, and then the invention of the internet, and then the invention of TikTok or whatever the heck is coming next. But reading we do for clarity and complexity. And, I really emphasize this with students. Look, we're going to read things that are just going to seem to make sense the first time you read them. And we want to look for, what are you missing that makes you think you understand it? but we're also going to read things that are complex, that you think, I don't get any of it. And you say, okay, what are things you do get? And so we really work a lot on reading. And I believe in giving students difficult reading and then helping them to find their way through it, right? I mean, I found that to be the most fruitful thing that we can do. And I tell them the same thing with their writing. Look, when you write, you do not have to write clearly. You can require your reader, me or others, to have to work to get to your point. Because you might be trying to say something that isn't clear to you. You're trying to clarify it for yourself. Or you might be trying to explain something that you already know is complex and you're struggling to find ways to explain it. And you can't ask your reader just to not have to do any work. It's okay for the reader to work. And I prove that to them by asking them to read Friedrich Nietzsche and Friedrich Engels from the 19th century in translation from German, right? So I provide them with two sets of readings. One is the one I just pointed to, set 2, I'm calling it, which is a debate between Nietzsche and Engels over what concepts do, what concepts are for. But I also give them a set of readings on concepts of rhetoric, argument, and language use. And the idea there is that in a writing class, we don't just write about whatever we want. You know, writing is usually housed in English. Sometimes it's housed in a department of writing studies or composition and rhetoric. And the whole point of writing is not just to be a service to the other areas of the college, but a writing class should do that, but a writing class also is part of a field of writing studies. What does it mean not just to write, but to reflect on your writing, to examine other people's writing, to analyze writing, to take apart writing and put it back together? Like, what does it mean to study writing? Not just to learn how to do a skill, but how to think with writing. And so one of the propositions I put in the syllabus is that writing is thinking. Writing is not a formal skill. And I put that as a proposition so that we can talk about what does it even mean. So why read on rhetoric in a writing class? I've begun to address that, but rhetoric is a key concept, and it's really the core of traditional debates in what we could call transdisciplinary writing studies. And if you want to ask me about that term, I'm glad to talk about it down the road. And I ask students to dig into texts by or about different folks who've written on rhetoric, whether it's Aristotle, whose logos, ethos, pathos, kairos. This is the classic rhetorical triangle, which actually has 4 points: logos, ethos, pathos. Kairos is the 4th point of the triangle. And I love explaining that with students because they think, wait a minute. It's like, good, you know geometry. But we also look at Stephen Toulmin's ideas of argument, looking at the idea that you have to have a warrant to connect evidence to a claim. And he has some other concepts. And then there's also the Rogerian argument that looks at common ground. So I try to introduce them to some different ways of thinking about argument and rhetoric, the use of language as a way to act in the world and to act on people. And so we read to conceptualize argument to make sense of some of these other ideas. All right, Nietzsche and Engels. I could do an hour on this, but I'm gonna not do an hour on this. I have more slides than I'm actually gonna look at with you. But one way into these discussions about concept is to offer students a meta concept of concept, right? To say, let's step back, and before we can talk about what concepts are, we need to talk about what is a concept. And before we talk about what concepts do, how they function, what they're supposed to do, how they help us, we need to think about what is a concept. So this is my, in a nutshell, version of the next like 8 slides. So Friedrich Nietzsche, in his essay on truth and lie in an extramoral sense, or it's sometimes translated as on truth and lie in a non-moral sense, Nietzsche claims that concepts are inadequate representations of reality. They simulate reality because the things that we take as truth or as truths, these concepts that we accept as true, are conventional. And just because something is conventional, Nietzsche is saying, doesn't mean we have to accept it as true, right? You can think of all kinds of examples of that, but Nietzsche says concepts are conventions that we've come to accept, and they limit us in ways that we shouldn't have to accept being limited. And he applies this actually not just to concepts, but to language and even to the moral guidelines in society, in civilization. These are all things we've inherited. And Nietzsche said, wait a minute, society began with fermentation and the discovery of alcohol. So why are you so focused on being conventional? He even uses very negative phrases or phrases that I read as negative as saying we need to break out of our herd, H-E-R-D, our herd mentality, thinking like sheep. Don't be sheeple, he's saying. And we also need to not have to accept linguistic legislation. Just because it's word doesn't mean it's the word, right? So when a student tells me, well, I looked up the definition of a word, like, wait a minute, you looked up a definition of a word. How many definitions can you find? And what would it mean to undefine a word, right? To break it from its definition, or to look at the way that a word is defined multiply. It's fractured. It's what some writers call a struggle concept, right? The concept of, Terry pointing to the concept of caste. To what extent is caste something that's set in stone and can't be changed? To what extent is caste, something that itself fractures in society and changes over time? So Nietzsche is very interested in, look, we shouldn't have to accept restrictions. And this is very appealing to students, right? We shouldn't have to accept restrictions. But his solution to that is kind of troubling for students, as you'll see in a moment. Engels, coming from a very different tradition, claims that concepts, yes, they are created by human beings. Yes, they are conventions. They are ways of thinking about things. Yes, language relies on concepts. Yes, concepts are social. They're part of a social contract of what things will mean. However, he says that doesn't mean that just because humans made them up that they're fictions, right? That definitions can be unlimiting. As soon as you can define something, you can now act on it, right? And this is where the recent discussion about divisive concepts is interesting. If we talk about racism, does that mean that we're contributing to racism? Or can an anti-racist have a definition of racism that they wish to use in the world, right? Or feminism, this great t-shirt, some people see feminism as a divisive concept. But there's a great t-shirt that says, feminism is the dangerous belief that women are people, right? Which is a really interesting way to characterize, if not define, feminism. So I point to these as examples of, there's an interesting tension that's represented in Nietzsche and Engels here. Nietzsche has a real problem with concepts and wishes to free us of conventional restrictions. Engels sees concepts as not only conventions, but conventions that are very useful. And they're useful because they reflect reality approximately. They're good approximations of reality. And then when a concept is no longer a good approximation of reality, we need a new concept. We might break through a concept. And he has some great examples of this that I discussed with students. So part of the split between them, I'm going to jump ahead to a different slide, is that both Nietzsche and Engels, and I'll go back in a moment, both Nietzsche and Engels identify a gap that Nietzsche sees as a problem and Engels sees as a reality. Nietzsche and Engels both identify a gap between the real world and the mind, or the social intellect, right? There's the real world, and then there's whatever's in the mind in human discourse. And for Nietzsche, that gap is evidence that knowing is not the same thing as being. That when we know things, we might know only conventional things. We might know things that we've just accepted from the culture. And just because we know it doesn't mean it's true, doesn't mean it's good, doesn't mean it's right. And so he says what we want to get to is not knowing, but being. So he has a problem with those conventions, and I'll show you a passage in a moment where he addresses that, and the way that conventions of knowing might block our access to truly being. And if he had a bumper sticker on his Volkswagen, it would say, we do not want to relate to reality, we want to be, right? For Engels, the gap between knowledge and existence is a social motive for us to do science, social science, to engage in any activity, critical activity. And it's a social and historical relation. This gap is the gap between what human society says it knows at any one point and what the reality is at that point. And clearly today, all of us in the room know way more about viruses than we knew a year ago, right? And unless you're an epidemiologist, you know way more than you did a year ago. And we know more about COVID now than we knew about it in July when my brother got it. He's fine. Or that we knew about it last February when we were starting to read about it in the newspaper. And I told my students before spring break, well, nice to know you, see you online after break, right? So, but we know more about viruses than 10 years ago, 20 years ago, the average person. But how do we know what we know about viruses is any good? How do I know whether or not to wear a mask? How do I know whether or not to use hand sanitizer, or what kind of mask, or is 6 feet enough or should it be 12 feet? Like, how do we know, right? Is there a truth? So there's a gap between our ideas and the truth. And so the way that these two writers deal with it, I'll go back to Nietzsche. So Nietzsche's stance on concepts can be summed up in these couple of sentences. He writes, and this is from that Truth and Lie essay. Nietzsche says, let us give special consideration to the formation of concepts. So what forms a concept? Every word immediately becomes a concept. Now, I like to pause when I read here. Every word immediately becomes a concept. Maybe. I mean, if I say virus, I'll say the word virus, you get a concept. You might even get an image, right? If I use a sentence, so-and-so got the coronavirus and had these symptoms. Now it's in a context of a sentence, and the concept that you get, there's the general concept of virus, but now it's more specific. If I say, I don't have coronavirus, I just have a stomach virus, then I've distinguished between two different shades of the meaning of a concept. But not every word doesn't immediately become a concept, because if I use the word autochthonous with my students, I sound like I sneezed or something, but it's a word. It means native, right? So every word does not immediately become a concept. It only becomes a concept in the context in which it's possible for that set of sounds or marks to lead us to a concept. And Nietzsche will address this. He says, every word immediately becomes a concept so long as we know the language in which it's spoken, inasmuch as it is not intended to serve as the reminder of the unique and wholly individualized original experience to which it owes its birth. So concepts, which come from words, are born. They have a birth. There's a unique and wholly individualized original experience. Look at all those words: unique, individualized, original. I mean, he's really concerned in this case with where does it come from? So much, I'm going to say it 3 times. It has an origin that's an individual origin that's unique. It's singular. It doesn't come from anywhere else, right? So if you say virus, can you now apply that to any virus? Or is it only one unique thing that can be called by that name? So every word immediately becomes a concept so far as it comes from an experience that produced it, but must at the same time fit innumerable more or less similar cases, which means, strictly speaking, never equal. In other words, a lot of unequal cases. So this sentence from Nietzsche is fascinating because it's got a great contradiction in it. Every word is both very singular and specific in its origin, and yet we're supposed to apply it to all these general cases. And so there's a tension between the general and the specific, the origin and the practice, right? And so he says these things are never equal. The particular, the singular, is not general. That's what makes it singular, right? The general is not particular. That's what makes it general. The general can be conventionalized. The singular is that which can't be conventionalized. It doesn't fit into any definition. It exceeds definition in the same way that experience exceeds our explanation of that experience. He even says they're not equal. And in case you didn't like his long sentence, he gives it to you in a bumper sticker. Every concept originates through our equating what is unequal. Now, that is a fascinating sentence to write about, right? If I wear that as a t-shirt to class, there's a lot to kind of work from there. Every concept originates through our equating what is unequal. And in the rest of the essay, Nietzsche addresses why this is a problem and why what we want to do is we want to get back to the singularity of experience by using language, using ideas, using images, using anything we can get our hands on to cut through convention, right? Because convention is what defines things, limits things. And for Nietzsche, that's all about knowing. I want to be, I want to exist. Right? So Nietzsche is quite interesting here to kind of present that to students in a real kind of dramatic fashion. And I have them read, it's about 12 paragraphs of the essay that we have. The essay is much longer than that. And I'm going to skip over my other slides on Nietzsche in the interest of time. But I wanted to mark the way in which Engels is responding to the same issue. So in a letter to Conrad Schmidt, right, Engels and Nietzsche lived in a time where people wrote letters to people and then saved those letters. Those letters got, gathered into books and published. They didn't tweet. They didn't send emails, right? But, they created an archive of their correspondence. And so we have interesting access to their thinking through that. And so from this particular letter, Engels is arguing with someone about concepts and writes in the following way: the identity of thought and being, to express myself in the Hegelian fashion. And so what I do when I read this with students, I'm like, so what do you think of the sentence so far, right? The identity of thought and being, to express myself in the Hegelian fashion. And they're like, don't know what that means. I said, all right, let's skip over the Hegelian fashion thing, because that's a whole Wikipedia search that will take us the rest of class. Well, let's think about the identity of thought and being. What is thinking? What is thought? We talk about that. What does it mean to be? How is being like thinking, and how is being different than thinking? So we could have, I had a student who referred to that. This is one of those Saturday night bong water questions. Like, oh, that's a really interesting way to put it, right? How do thinking and being relate? Because, my water bottle has existence. I'm pretty sure it doesn't think, right? I think, therefore I am. Somebody said that once, right? Or I am, therefore I can think. Somebody else said that. But the idea that thinking and being have some connection to each other, but we can separate them because my water bottle doesn't think. I think, I also am pretty sure I exist. Maybe I just think I exist. And I'm like, oh, there we go down that. So the identity of thought and being, the relationship of thinking and being, or if you like, the relationship of college and living, thinking and being, college and just living, right? What's that relationship? Everywhere coincides with the example of the circle and the polygon. So at this point, I like to ask the students, what's a circle? What's a polygon? What's the difference? And I draw circles on the board and I say, is this a circle? They're like, no, it's not a circle. And I said, well, if I drew it as a circle in geometry class, would you say? I'm like, no, you got to use a compass. You got to have a point. It's got to be equidistant and you're on a plane and you go, oh, you define circle. I said, okay, what's a polygon? Well, a polygon, I said, is a circle a polygon? They're like, no, a circle's not a polygon. I said, well, actually, a circle is a very special kind of polygon. I'm like, what? I said, because what's a polygon? Well, polygon is just a contained space in a plane, with lines. There's John's lines or somebody's lines again, contains a space and, has sides. We call those lines sides. And I said, how many sides does a circle have? And someone will say, an inside and an outside. I'm like, oh, you're playing games with language. And so we say, no, a circle has one sort of curving side. I said, yeah, but think about it this way. Is a triangle like a circle? How is it? How is it not? Is a square more like a circle than a triangle? I'm like, I don't think so. Okay, how about a stop sign, an octagon? Is that more like a circle than a triangle? Yeah, okay, I can see that. And then we said, well, what if the polygon had 64 sides? Or what if it had, 128 sides? Or what if it had infinite sides? And then there'll be the kid who goes, oh, the infinite sided polygon, each line would have become a point, and now you've got a circle. A circle is an infinitely sided polygon. But we can never draw or computer program an infinitely sided polygon It would just, we're not going to get there. So the example of the circle and the polygon is really interesting to them. It's a visual image, which I have learned that I'm apparently a visual learner. And so I need the board and I draw the stuff, and it helps the students who need that. So a circle and a polygon, polygons approach a circle. And Engels says this, or the two of them, the circle and a series of polygons with more and more sides, the concept of a thing and its reality. The circle is the concept of the infinitely sided polygon that doesn't exist in reality. The polygon, they exist in reality. I see stop signs every day. Is it a perfect polygon? No, it started to rust or the lines aren't straight or whatever, but it's close enough. That's the thing that Engels and Nietzsche disagree about. The two of them, the concept of a thing and its reality, run side by side like two asymptotes. And asymptotes are, that the line that gets closer and closer and closer to another line, but never touches it infinitely. Like, is it Zeno's paradox, where I can walk halfway to the door and then half of halfway to the door and then half and half of half, but I'll never get to the door. Right? Two asymptotes, great concept for them, a nice image, always approaching yet never meeting. Thinking and being can approach each other, but they'll never meet. The concept of a thing and the thing itself will never be the same thing, right? So actual freedom and the concept of freedom, those are two different things. Is it because it's the realization of a concept that somehow pre-exists before practice, or something else? Engels says no. He says the difference between the two, between thinking and being, is the very difference which prevents the concept being directly and immediately reality, and reality from being immediately its own concept. For me, it would be interesting to look with students at the use of immediately by both Nietzsche and Engels. And he says, although a concept has the essential nature of a concept and therefore cannot therefore directly coincide with reality, from which it must first be abstracted. Oops. Sorry, I'm getting used to PowerPoint. It is still something more than a fiction. So concepts come from reality. Concepts are abstracted from reality. Concepts don't pre-exist reality in some other realm for either Nietzsche or Engels, but concepts can come to exist in the mind because of the reality in which we form those concepts. But Nietzsche and Engels disagree on this question of the value of concepts because of this gap. So whereas for Nietzsche, he wants to try to break through the conventions of knowing. For Engels, how do we develop reliable knowledge? And he emphasizes science and critical thinking or critique. That the way that we get to knowledge that we can test and rely on in the sciences, if we're in the physical sciences, we can establish certain things. We can have really good concepts that can explain what happens and how stuff works. In the life sciences, and life is evolving at a faster rate than the physical sciences are. So we have to kind of struggle to keep up. I mean, we're still struggling over theory of evolution. I guess we're still struggling over plate tectonics, but the concepts that go with those theories are really interesting to look at and are evolving, are developing as we attempt in that asymptotic relationship. How do we develop concepts to explain the world in which we exist? And one of the concepts of the last century is the concept of global warming, right? I mean, this is a concept that, for me was news in the 70s and 80s when I first heard about it. But our students now, most of our students, especially if they, were born in this century, that concept has been all around them, and they've become aware of the debates but the concept isn't alien to them. The concept is there and available to them because concepts develop historically. And this is Engels' point. Concepts develop historically. They're abstracted from the relations in which people are thinking. And that doesn't make them fictions. It does make them constructs, social constructs. But social constructs are for something. They allow us to explain developments in the natural world, to study our own interactions in bodies, to study society. Okay. So I'm going to jump ahead a little bit, but kind of cut that short and see what you'd like to pick up on, just looking at the clock on the wall. So, so far, since I'm working on this over the next year, so far in 2020, I've been working with students on writing about concepts. We're engaging Nietzsche and Engels. We're engaging the concepts they're bringing in from other courses. We're engaging these concepts on rhetoric. We're reflecting on which concepts seem useful to us, which ones we're still puzzled by, which things are hard to conceptualize. We're analyzing texts on relevant issues. So I have groups of students working on, doing some research on COVID research. I have students who don't want to talk about COVID, so they're looking at things like, mental health issues, or I have a group that just wants to talk about, artificial intelligence and machine learning. So, their different groups are exploring different things, but what are the concepts they need there? Next semester, I want to work at bringing in more concepts from other classes, because that proved to be really valuable this semester. So I want to make more space for it in the class. And I'm actually shifting some of the projects in the class to account for that. And then, a year from now, when I hope to give part 2 of this talk, I really want to work to clarify some of the threshold concepts for the course. What are the concepts that I think students need to know in a sophomore level writing course, right? At least in the ones I teach. I'm going to make a curricular proposal to the department, and I don't know if Jivan's going to go for it or not, but I'm going to make a proposal and we'll argue about it, right? And maybe it will become a new curriculum, or maybe it will just become that weird thing that Faivre does in his classroom. I don't care, right? I mean, we'll find out, right? So I want to clarify some threshold concepts for my course, and possibly for a curricular proposal, and definitely for a book on pedagogy that I'm working on, something that I'd like to make available even through SUNY. There's a new imprint in the SUNY press that has pedagogy books written by SUNY professors, and it's called 64 Inc. Terry, it looks really interesting actually. And it's an opportunity for faculty in the SUNY system. There's 64 entities, community colleges and universities and colleges in the system. There's a lot of us working on teaching. What would it mean if we were going to, publish books and online educational resources that way? And also I'm interested in working with students on both understanding the conventional disciplinary concepts in the different fields and in writing studies, but also what are the struggle concepts? What are the contradictions? What are the critical concepts that people argue about? And what are the concepts? This isn't a phrase that I've referred to really. The writer Miki Ball refers to traveling concepts, concepts that without people meaning to move across discourse and fields. So I think the concept of sustainability is one of those concepts, or the concept of quantum. Quantum theory in physics is very interesting, but I'm seeing books now on quantum poetics, or Beth, I don't know if you know about this, but there's quantum counseling. I don't even know what that would be. Quantum is the idea that something happens over here affects something over here. And I don't know, maybe family systems theory would be part of that or something. So, well, yeah, that's good. So let me come, I'll just come back to one slide, and then I'll stop sharing my screen, Jivan. How's that?
That's fine.
Stop sharing. Okay, so I've stopped sharing. I wanted to see if people had questions. It does look like there's something in the chat too. So I'm open to questions, but I don't know. Jivan, are you chairing this thing? How do you want to do it?
Exactly as you want.
Oh, really?
It's open. Yeah, the floor is open for questions right now.
Well, let me read what's in the chat and then see what you'd like to talk about. And also, Amy, Stephanie, John, and Bob have all contributed some writing to this. They sent some texts that I haven't specifically brought them into this presentation, but they are things that I'd like to share with students, and so I'll be following up with each of you about that. So you may have things you'd like to say, but let me read what's in the chat in case people can't see that, and see what you want to pick up on. So Stephanie says, one of my research professors used to say, there are worlds attached to words or concepts. There are worlds attached to words or concepts, right? So,
yeah, as you were talking, that just sort of triggered that memory. I used to say that, and it just kind of this idea that any word you pick, like the word line, has a history and a history of way it is used by people. And so in different contexts. And so not just the history of it, but the current day-to-day usage of it. And so it's a whole world attached to it. And this is a struggle for some of our developmental students. They're not privy to those worlds. And so we throw off these words, assuming that they've got all that background historical data, and it's very hard and tough to nail down.
yeah. Yeah, I think when I see your next post, the word patriot comes to mind. I mean, here we are on Veterans Day, obviously, so we've been primed maybe to think about such a word. I don't know what else is going on in the world where you might be thinking about that. But you know, that word has a, you know, to think of some of the language of some of the threshold concepts from reading, you know, a word has a denotation and connotations, right? It has a dictionary definition, and it has all those kind of worldly elements, to use your phrase, Stephanie, that would come to the mind of a reader if they're in that world. But otherwise, it might just, you know, I look at the word patriot and I think New England Patriots, even though I don't follow football. I mean, it's just part of the world.
Song by Little Steven, I Am a Patriot. And so where he's trying to capture the term, you know, and use it in a, what does a patriot mean? It's a neat song. You guys all probably know it.
Hey, Rob, what does Nietzsche say about, I mean, Nietzsche's all about being. What about connecting beings? I mean, Terry just wrote something about language. Where is he?
He's really skeptical about that. I mean, there are ways to connect with people that might be authentic if they escape convention. But if we just are following convention, like if I grow up, get married, have a family, get a job, go through all of that, am I really connecting? Or am I just going through the accepted conventions of it? Or I'm thinking even in the world of counseling, if for somebody, the way you connect to somebody is you abuse them, or you know, treat them the same way that your dad you know, whatever those conventions without reflecting on it. I mean, to me, I think I'm trying to imagine a counseling session with Nietzsche, but I don't want to go there. But yeah, it is that question of what would it mean to authentically know your being and to authentically connect with other people without falling into those conventions. And to him, it doesn't seem that there's any conventions that he accepts. At the same time, a contradiction, of course, is that he's using the essay and writing to express himself, but he goes against logic by using aphorisms, by trying to write with these little bumper stickers that kind of break up what we're doing here. So, I mean, that's as far as I go with Nietzsche, because I, you know, read him in this context. I know, you know, if Bob is reading Nietzsche in relation to philosophy, or if somebody else is reading Nietzsche in relation to literary studies or psychological theory or art, or, I mean, the guy wrote on everything. He wrote on tragedy, you know, he wrote on the concept of the Ubermensch, or the Superman, who, you know, doesn't need people, you know, can defend themselves and rise above all convention and just be. That's a great question to think about. I mean, I'm aware that I risk reducing Nietzsche and Engels to caricatures of themselves. And, you know, there are worlds attached to them too, right? So in fact, when students see Frederick Engels, they go to Wikipedia and they're like, Marx and Engels, Communist Manifesto? I can't write about this, right? I mean, you know, I said, well, you could, you know, if you think it's important to address the Communist Manifesto and thinking about thinking and being, knock yourself out. I'll help you with that. But don't just evoke the common sense. Think carefully about it, right here. I see that Krista is citing into philosophy too, when Krista writes, Discourse on Method and Meditations on First Philosophy by Rene Descartes is a great read. He's the fella who said, I think, therefore I am, right? And you can see the way in which, you know, I think, and this is again to go back to Stephanie and Worlds, you can see how Nietzsche is dealing with that relation of thinking and being in a way that comes out of the legacy of Descartes, comes out of that problem of, can I be deceived in my thinking? You know, is it possible for me to have reliable knowledge of my being?
Another interesting thing that Descartes talks about was the role of the senses, and like whether we can trust our senses, because those are what we depend on in our day-to-day experiences, and they kind of establish our sense of reality. But it kind of goes into like the whole like matrix kind of thing, like where it's like, can you be like a prisoner of an imagined freedom, where your senses are like deceiving you and things like that. So yeah, I think it's kind of a fun read if you're interested. But yeah.
Yeah. You know, and you know, ideally a writing class wouldn't just be 16 weeks, it would be 16 years. And then we could like do the real work, right? I mean, I feel like that's how long it took me to do my dissertation. So it felt like work. Chris, did you just say prisoner of an imagined freedom?
Yes.
That's like poetry. I'm writing that down.
Cool.
Rob, how are your students doing with this abstraction of concepts? I find when I try to really get them to work on some of these concepts, the one that I wrote was for statistics, they really want the more concrete things, like tell me how to calculate this formula that measures variation rather than what is variation.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, obviously, some of our students, their time is so pinched, they're so bound up in convention and demand that it's got to be real practical. What can I do with this, right? In fact, Amy, I don't know if you know this, but they say this about math. I don't need this stuff in the real world. Why do I have to take this class? It's like phys ed. I don't need to be, and I'm only taking this writing class because it's required. I said, not anymore, you're not, right? I mean, you're asking an interesting question, which is, what's the use of this, right? So I don't mean to dodge Amy's question, but you know, what are they doing with it? So different students are doing different things. Some are incredibly practically oriented in terms of, well, what do I need to do just to write this paper? And some of them are so bound up in convention that they write the 5-paragraph theme that doesn't really do anything. They write an introduction that introduces nothing. They write a conclusion that doesn't conclude anything. And they write 3 body paragraphs that are like beads on a string, but it's a weird necklace, right? It's really strange. So you point out, so then some of the concepts in the class are, let's think about what does it mean to compose? What does it mean to give something an order? What does it mean to have purposeful paragraphs that relate not only to themselves, but relate to each other? What does it mean to have a key concept that you're trying to explain? So one of the things that they do in writing is they do what you did in your essay on variation. They say, well, let's define the term. Let's think about, you know, where my professor thinks this term is useful. How did she use it in her class? And then, is it possible to make use of this at the gas station? Or like you in your piece, Amy, write about, you know, how does a concept of variation help us to think about the way in which we understand COVID and the symptoms that people have from COVID and how things differ across the map and that sort of thing. So some of it is a little bit of a what if speculation, because it's not all going to work for them in their first job or, you know, something like that. In fact, I have a colleague who says in his first class, he teaches writing down in the CUNY system. He says, if you're taking this class because you think it's going to help you to get a job, I'm sorry to tell you that this class is going to help you get fired. And for some people, that's like, I'm fine with that because my life is not just my work, right? I'm a free thinker and I am not bound by convention. And I'm, you know, so, but others are like, no, I really want to work in public health and I really need to know a concept like variation or symptomology or X or Y or Z. I'm going to need it in my work. And other students are very insistent that everybody needs to become educated about wearing masks and maintaining social distance and knowing what's a good way to clean your hands, and it doesn't count to wipe them on your pants, or all that stuff. So I mean, I would say everything has a use, even if it's not a practical use. When the question says, what's the use? What's the use of doing this? Like, that's a great question. Like, it wasn't a question, it was a rhetorical statement. I'm like, no, I heard a question. You asked me, what's the use of this concept? Let's look into that. Who's using it? What are they using it for? Who else uses it? What do they use it for? I see a couple other things in the chat. Are there other things people want to raise up in relation to what we're talking about?
I guess just to maybe just piggyback off of what Amy had mentioned, I think it's quite a revolutionary way of encouraging our students to think, particularly some of our students who may be from a more working class educated background, where they have been for some time more encouraged to passively accept concepts throughout their learning experience, and who are kind of bringing that tradition of learning along with them, and who are the students that I'm working with are first gen and are learning how to do college in that same way, sort of passively. They have a lot to learn about the concepts of college, right? Like, what is financial aid? What is a course? What is a credit? And so I'm wondering if there's any cognitive dissonance. I mean, they're learning a whole new set of concepts just to survive in this space. At the same time, you're asking them to like blow it up, right? Blow up everything that you know, challenge everything you know, everything. You're asking them to manipulate knowledge in a new way. For the sociologists in the room, you're like breaking their habitus, right? You're making them uncomfortable. Maybe some of them who haven't necessarily been given the power, in a sense, to manipulate knowledge in that way. So I'm wondering if you've gotten any, I don't know if those 5-paragraph essays are just kind of going back to a sense of security for some of the students who are not quite ready or understand how to wield that power in a sense yet, or what your sense of that is.
Well, let's use the example of the 5-paragraph essay, because that is not something that I learned growing up. I grew up in Vermont, and we learned the Vermont writing process, and it was not at all about generating a particular form. It was about a process of generation or invention, a process of revision, a process of, it was really interesting, a bunch of hippies or something, I don't know. But when I do encounter these students who do have, that's a convention that they've learned, it's not that we want to necessarily just throw out the convention. So I mean, disruptive, yes, but not totally, like not anarchistically disruptive. If they say, look, let's identify this as a convention. I was thinking about that, putting together a PowerPoint. I said to my partner, Julie, this morning, I said, this is my first PowerPoint, and I can see already the use of PowerPoint, like the 5-paragraph theme. It has a use. It can contain things in little boxes, and you can think about how box A relates to box B, relates to box C. It has a unity. But I can also see how it's really limiting, because the more you type, the smaller the font gets, right? The harder it gets to read, right? And so these little boxes are made of ticky-tack, and they can only hold so much, right? And they're pretty, and you can manipulate the color and all. Just like in a 5-paragraph theme, you can put anything you want in a paragraph. But some students say, when I learned the 5-paragraph theme, I learned that the introduction and the conclusion should be mirrors of each other. They should have a relationship. So then we can say, okay, what is the relationship of either bookend? But also that, you might have a thesis, an antithesis, and a synthesis. Some people actually learned that, right? So they're going to set something up. They're going to propose something, examine it, examine the other side or the common ground with another side or objections to it, and then come up with some kind of resolution. I mean, they're doing dialectics and they don't even know it. And then they're going to wrap it up. But if they're doing a conventional dialectics, then it just becomes about the form. And that's why I say, writing is thinking. It's not just a formal skill. We do need to know the forms and recognize the forms and what are the forms expected of us. If I'm going to write a a business letter, or if I'm going to write an essay for a class, or if I'm going to write an application to school. Like I need to know those forms, Mary, like you're saying. Like I need to know how to negotiate the financial aid office, and I need the stuff I didn't need to know out there. But also there should be space for messiness, right? And so when a student's first draft is a 5-paragraph theme, I say, all right, you know, if we were in a classroom, I'd get out the scissors and have you cut this thing to bits and we'll put it in a bag and shake it up. And you got to see what happens if somebody else takes it out of the bag, tries to put it together, right? Or what if we read it backwards instead of forward, just to try to kind of break with convention. I mean, that's one of the things I value about Nietzsche, is that he invites us to break with convention, to examine that convention. He might toss it out, but I like Engels next to him because he too values convention, but he's not going to toss it out. He wants to break through it to a better set of conventions, a better set of definitions. And, you know, a great example of this in science writing classes, we talk about, you know, what do you know about diabetes? Some people know nothing. Oh, it's the sugars. Or you can't go to Cumberland Farms anymore if you got the diabetes, they'll say. Or somebody will have it and they'll be able to tell you all about it. And they know the difference between juvenile diabetes and adult onset. I say, okay, it's 1950. What do you know about diabetes? It's 1850. I mean, at a certain point, it doesn't exist, right? And at a certain point, it didn't exist because we weren't using high fructose corn syrup since 1972 when it was introduced into the food supply by Earl Butz. Like it wasn't as big a problem before that. And so then they see, oh, like Stephanie says, these things have worlds. They have a history. They have a cross-section in time, but they have a historical development. So I appreciate, Mary, what you're saying about not blowing up the house, blowing up the habitus.
No,
but also
blow it up. I'm wondering what the reaction is. No, I mean, I just, as a first-gen student in, you know, walking into the world of linguistic anthropology, ended up majoring in, because those are some of the textbooks I could afford at the time. But wow. You know, as opposed to some of the psychology textbooks that were pretty expensive. But you know, the kinds of conversations that you're having, you know, again, I know I'm going to see with a lot of students who are understanding like who Nietzsche was, and there's a history there, and I'm hearing names for the first time and having to do the Googles, you know, back in 2000 when there wasn't really the Googles, you know. So I didn't have hats to hang it on, and I didn't have all of that, and I would have been spooked by Marx, but I had sort of this moment I remember of like, whoa, like first of all, all of my concepts are very compartmentalized, and there's so much more to know than what I know. And everybody else seems much more comfortable than I do as a student in kind of playing with these concepts and challenging what they know than I do. And it took me a while to get comfortable with that, you know, and so that's what I'm wondering, you know, how students are responding to that, especially now I'm seeing, you know, we've also had 20 years of some Common Core and standardized testing, and I'm seeing even more of that, even with students who didn't come from an economic background like I did, just because of the way we're doing schooling. It's a little bit, all right, what do I need to do for this to get this right? And so, you know, are they feeling empowered? Are they feeling challenged and excited about this? Or are they kind of feeling like, ooh, you know? So yeah, I'm all for blowing it up. I'm just, you know, wondering what the reaction has.
Well, both. I mean, just by asking students to read difficult texts, you get everybody in this Zoom knows this. There'll be the students who are intimidated by the reading, and there'll be the students who run with the reading. And my favorite group is the students who think they understand the reading, but don't, right? They're the most interesting to work with because there's a lot to hang on to, because they're willing to generate text. But then you have to say, all right, show me how you got that from this. And I know you got that from Google or Wikipedia. Kudos to you for looking that up, but I'm not sure what this over here really has to do with this over here. In fact, one semester I had an essay I wanted students to read, and instead of giving them by the author, I paraphrased it and put a fake name on it so they couldn't Google it. And that way we could read it, engage with the ideas, And then I was going to do a big reveal at the end. And I thought, no, I don't need to. And so I have a pseudonym. I took the word Adirondack backwards, Casey Adnorita. So Casey Adnorita, I want to put together a web page for Casey Adnorita, because then I could have like some cred on the web, and there'll be these texts that would be out there and apparently were published. and that way the student who Google, then I can see who's Googling it, right? And I was thinking even a Wikipedia page on that author would be really great.
It's like the NASA.
That's a lot of work.
You know, that piece.
It's a lot of work. So how are we doing for time, Jivan?
Okay, I'm muted. I didn't realize that. We have 9 minutes left.
All right.
Two.
So I see stuff in the chat, but I mean, are there things that people wanted to raise or follow up on? I mean, you guys are saying really interesting things that I've made 2 pages of notes on, which is very helpful to me. But comments, questions, suggestions?
Rob, I have a quick comment. It's Rebecca. I know you're a great follower of the arts, but you know, within art history, we have to talk about religion and mathematics and class and language. And you can't talk about a work of art without delving into those other concepts. And certainly Nietzsche's concepts factor heavily into German Expressionism. That was really one of their guide when they were creating the artwork. So did you know that Yale University is phasing out the art history survey class?
No.
Because they are moving into a more focused concept, what should I say, more focused disciplines instead of the survey. So now they're moving into, say, art and politics and sacred places and art and gender. And doing away with the survey class. So it's a completely different approach to those concepts that we once covered as sort of more general terms, and picking it apart completely into multiple classes. I'm just curious what you think about that approach.
That's really interesting. So that's, I mean, that's a way to work across the disciplines. So rather than, if I'm understanding it, rather than art history being its own survey, almost like part of its own discipline, it would be more interdisciplinary, and it could change according to, you know, art and public health, or art and X, art and Y, art and Z. So art still becomes an area of inquiry, but it's connected. I mean, I can see the same thing happen with literature. I mean, we have courses in American Lit surveys and Brit Lit surveys, but, you know, is that a direction that Yale's going to go with its English department too? So that rather than taking 2 semesters of American Lit or 2 semesters of Brit Lit, you would have, you know, transatlantic literature, Englishes and literature in English, and the topic of the day or something. I mean, those topics courses usually show up at the junior level and beyond, but I mean, are you going to do that at Adirondack?
No, I think we're keeping the survey class.
Oh, you do? Well, I heard that Yale's getting rid of it, so why should you keep it?
You know, we always follow what Yale does, but in this case.
That's great. That's great. Cool. I like to tell my students this is my favorite moment where I just go.
I have to go to class, but I was intrigued by your first couple of slides, Rob, on perception and conception, because so much of, especially students, but many people's perception now is what's fed to them through like their Facebook feeds and social media feeds.
Yeah.
But your idea of a concept, like you talked about global warming, that concept could be different to different people based on their perceptions through what they're being fed in their social media.
Yeah, in fact, in composition studies, which relates closely to a interdisciplinary field called cultural studies, you know, really, I think the 80s and the 90s were the heyday of that. I mean, really started to look at media, especially television, but there's some really interesting composition work being done now in writing studies, looking at how social media shapes our perception and spreads different concepts and actually kind of mashes those things together. And one really interesting project I saw, I forget the journal, but I'll try to find it. But it's typical kind of project, has students analyze somebody else's Facebook page or analyze somebody's Instagram account or collect and analyze TikTok videos about football, or, something like that. Because it's endless, somebody called it endless cultural vomit. It's just coming at you like Kardashians through a fire hose. And it's just all this constant flow of stuff. Was that negative? There's all this stuff that's out there.
It's just visual.
Yeah.
Like the concept of the Kardashians, I believe.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Shooting out of a hose, yes.
Yeah. I like to pretend I don't know who the Kardashians are. And so I'm like, Snooki Kardashian, which one is she? And they're like, what are you talking about?
It's interesting when you talk about how these conceptions change too, because, I see this teaching general anthro courses, and when I bring up evolution in physical anthro, which is such a hallmark of any science, right? Immediately you see the eyes like, oh my God, she used the E word. This is going to be political. This is going to be controversial. And I have to very, gently and keep repeating that this is not a rogue concept. It's change, it's not that big of a deal. But their eyes are darting around like, oh my God, are my parents going to think that I'm listening to this?
I haven't noticed that in my biology class or my marine biology class. Maybe I'm not looking for it, but I don't notice people seeming concerned that I'm going in a weird place.
Yeah. Actually, Amy, that's a really interesting point, and Val too, because Roger Egan used to have a statement, right, in his biology or zoology class about how you're going to have to check your values at the door because we're going to talk about evolution. And he said there was a point at which he didn't need it anymore.
Yeah. For his Bio 111 class, I think the zoology class that he's teaching right now, he's got full chapters from Darwin and stuff. I mean, I don't have anyone questioning me about evolution, and we don't teach it like it's something to be questioned. It's our science.
Yeah.
We have to do an anthro too, but it's interesting that you always get one or two that are completely resistant. I have one guy sat in the front row with a Bible, and he would open the Bible and not take any notes and do it like right in my face. He was right in the front row, and I'm like, whatever floats your boat, dude. You can't make me think.
How do you do on the tests?
I know, right?
But that kind of resistance is amazing, or that nervousness. And we think about the anti-intellectualism, talking about these elitists, these college professors. And I'm like, God, we're trying to teach them how to write a coherent sentence. I don't think that's terribly radical. A completely different notion of what we're doing in education, right?
Yeah. Cool stuff.
And the same thing happened in archaeology. We're talking about understanding about climate change, global climate change, and you still get that same resistance, It's like, there really was an ice age, things were different.
Yeah. And, people's